History often remembers wars, revolutions, and great leaders. But buried beneath those chapters are stories so dark, so disturbing, that time itself tried to erase them. Stories that were never meant to be told aloud. Stories whispered in shadows, and forgotten on purpose. This is one of those stories. A story born in the 19th century, during one of the most brutal periods in American history. The era of slavery. To understand what happened, we must first understand where it happened. And what kind of world allowed such a decision to exist. In the early 1800s, the southern United States was dominated by vast plantations. Miles of land stretched endlessly, covered in cotton fields, sugarcane, and tobacco. At the center of these lands stood large plantation houses, symbols of wealth, power, and authority. But beneath that elegance was a horrifying truth. These plantations were built on the suffering of enslaved human beings. Men, women, and even children were bought, sold, punished, and controlled like property. They had no legal identity. No freedom. No protection. Their bodies, labor, and lives belonged entirely to someone else. At the top of this system stood the plantation owner. A man whose word was law. A man who controlled land, money, and people, both free and enslaved. In many regions of states like Georgia and South Carolina, plantation owners were treated like kings. Their decisions were rarely questioned. Their actions were hidden behind social status and silence. And it is in this world that our story begins. The plantation at the center of this narrative was known for its size and productivity. Hundreds of enslaved workers labored from sunrise to sunset. Overseers enforced discipline with violence. Fear was routine. Cruelty was normal. To the outside world, everything looked orderly, profitable, successful. But inside the plantation house, something was deeply wrong. The plantation owner had a daughter. She was not like the women society celebrated at the time. She was often described as obese, unmarried, and socially withdrawn. In a world obsessed with appearances, she was seen as a disappointment. A burden. A reminder of failure. While other daughters of wealthy families were married off to powerful men. She remained isolated, locked inside the mansion, away from society, away from dignity. Her life was shaped by silence and shame. In the 19th century, a woman's worth was measured by marriage, beauty, and obedience. And when she failed to meet those expectations, she was treated as invisible. Even by her own family. Especially by her own father. The plantation owner was obsessed with reputation. Neighbors whispered. Relatives judged. Society watched. And slowly, resentment grew inside him, not toward society, but toward his own daughter. In his mind, she was not a person with emotions. She was a problem to be solved. And in a system where human beings were already treated as objects, the unthinkable became possible. On the same land lived an enslaved man. Strong. Silent. Controlled by fear and survival. Like all enslaved people, he had no choice in his fate. No control over his body. No voice. His past, his pain, his dreams, none of it mattered. To the plantation owner, he was not a man. He was property. And soon, he would become part of a decision that would change everything. What followed was not a single moment of horror, but a slow descent into moral darkness. A decision made behind closed doors. A command no one dared to question. A silence that allowed evil to breathe. This was not an act of passion. It was an act of power. Power used without humanity. Authority exercised without conscience. After that decision, the plantation never felt the same again. Workers whispered at night. Fear spread through the fields. Strange incidents began to occur. Accidents. Deaths. Fires. Some said it was coincidence. Others believed the land itself was cursed. But one thing was certain. Something deeply unnatural had been set in motion. This story is not just about one plantation. It is about a system that allowed people to believe they were gods over others. A system where cruelty was legal and silence was survival. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What happens when power has no limits? What happens when human beings are reduced to tools? And what happens when a father forgets his own humanity? As we move forward, we will uncover the layers of this story. The psychology, the fear, the consequences, and the truth behind the legend. Because this is not just a tale of the past. It is a warning. And the darkness has only just begun. To understand the horror of what happened on that plantation, we must first understand the system that made it possible. Because this story did not begin with one cruel man. It began with an entire society built on slavery. In 19th century America, slavery was not hidden. It was legal. It was protected by law. And it was defended as necessary for the economy. Millions of Africans and their descendants were enslaved. Forced to work without pay, without rights, and without freedom. They were not considered citizens. They were not considered people. They were considered property. Under the law, enslaved people could be bought, sold, inherited, punished, or killed. Often without consequence. Families were separated. Children were taken from their mothers. Husbands and wives were sold to different plantations. There was no appeal. No justice. Only obedience, or suffering. Plantations functioned like small kingdoms. At the top was the plantation owner. A man whose authority was absolute. Below him were overseers. Men hired to enforce discipline through violence. And at the bottom were the enslaved workers. Living under constant fear. Every movement was watched. Every mistake was punished. Workdays began before sunrise and ended after sunset. Enslaved men, women, and children labored in the fields for 14 to 16 hours a day. They harvested cotton, sugarcane, and tobacco. The crops that fueled America's wealth. Their bodies were pushed beyond exhaustion. Illness was ignored. Injuries were treated as inconvenience. If someone collapsed, another enslaved person replaced them. Life was disposable. But slavery was not only physical violence. It was psychological destruction. Enslaved people were stripped of names, culture, language, and identity. They were forbidden to read. Forbidden to gather. Forbidden to resist. Fear was the system's greatest weapon. And perhaps the most disturbing truth of all. The system did not stop at labor. It extended into the most intimate parts of human life. Enslaved bodies were not protected by law. This meant plantation owners could exercise control over marriage, family, reproduction, physical relationships. Enslaved women were often abused without consequence. Enslaved men were dehumanized and humiliated. There were no boundaries. Power erased morality. This is the world in which our story exists. A world where one man could decide the fate of another human being. With a single sentence. A world where silence was survival. And resistance meant death. Now imagine what happens when such a system collides with personal shame, social pressure, and unchecked authority. Imagine a man who already believes he owns human lives. What would stop him from crossing another line? In plantation society, reputation meant everything. Owners were judged not by morality, but by productivity, wealth, and social standing. A perfect family image was essential. Any weakness, a scandal, an unmarried daughter, a public embarrassment, was seen as a threat. And threats had to be eliminated. Women in this era had little power, even in wealthy families. Their lives were controlled by fathers and husbands. Their value measured by obedience, appearance, and marriage. If a woman failed to meet these standards, she became invisible. Or worse, a liability. Combine this with slavery, and the result is catastrophic. Because in a system where people are already treated as objects, ethics disappear completely. Human beings become tools. Bodies become currency. And cruelty becomes routine. The enslaved man in this story lived inside this reality. He had no protection. No consent. No escape. Every command given to him carried the weight of violence behind it. Refusal was not an option. Silence was survival. This is why the decision that followed was not an accident. It was not madness. It was the logical outcome of a system that normalized domination and erased humanity. When people ask, how could something like this happen? The answer is simple and terrifying. Because the system allowed it. Because society ignored it. Because power went unquestioned, and once that line was crossed, there was no turning back. The plantation was no longer just a place of forced labor. It became a place of moral collapse. We will look closely at the man who stood at the center of it all. The plantation owner himself. His mindset. His pride. His fear. And how one man's obsession with control set tragedy into motion. To understand the tragedy that unfolded, we must look closely at the man who stood at the center of it all. The plantation owner. Not as a monster born from nothing, but as a product of power, pride, and a society that never told him no. In the 19th century South, a plantation owner was more than a wealthy landholder. He was a symbol of authority. His word carried weight. His name opened doors. His presence commanded silence. In churches, courts, and social gatherings, men like him were respected. Sometimes even feared. No one questioned how he ruled his land. What happened on the plantation stayed on the plantation. Power shaped his identity. From a young age, he was taught that leadership meant control. That strength meant dominance. That compassion was weakness. He inherited land. But he also inherited a belief system. One that told him he was superior. Superior by birth. Superior by race. Superior by wealth. And when power is never challenged, it begins to feel like destiny. The plantation owner believed everything under his roof belonged to him. The fields. The buildings. The enslaved workers. And eventually, the lives of those closest to him, including his own daughter. In his world, family was not about emotional connection. It was about legacy. Children were extensions of reputation. Daughters were social assets. They were expected to marry well, strengthen alliances, and reflect perfection. Anything less was unacceptable. His daughter did not fit that image. She did not attract suitors. She did not bring admiration. She invited whispers. And whispers were dangerous. Neighbors talked. Relatives judged. Society observed quietly, but relentlessly. To a man obsessed with status, this felt like humiliation. Instead of seeing his daughter as a human being in pain, he saw her as a problem. A reminder of failure. A threat to his carefully constructed image. And slowly, resentment replaced responsibility. This is where ego takes control. Rather than questioning himself, he blamed her. Rather than showing compassion, he chose control. Because in a system where enslaved people had no rights, he had already learned one terrible lesson. If you have power, you can make others pay for your discomfort. The plantation owner did not wake up one day intending to destroy lives. His decision grew slowly. Fed by pride. Nurtured by silence. Protected by society. Every time someone looked away, his sense of entitlement grew stronger. In his mind, morality was flexible. What mattered was order. What mattered was reputation. What mattered was dominance. And when dominance becomes the highest value, humanity becomes optional. Society played a critical role. Neighbors benefited from the same system. Local authorities depended on men like him. Religious leaders often remained silent. There was no accountability. No consequences. Power moved freely. Unchecked. This is why the line he crossed felt invisible to him. The same society that allowed human beings to be bought and sold also allowed him to believe he could decide the fate of others. Without explanation. Including the fate of his daughter. Including the fate of an enslaved man. The plantation owner convinced himself that his decision was practical. Necessary. Even justified. That belief is what makes this story so disturbing. Because evil does not always appear as rage or chaos. Sometimes, it appears calm. Calculated. Confident. Once the decision was made, he did not hesitate. Orders were given quietly. Instructions delivered without emotion. And everyone around him understood one thing clearly. This was not a request. It was a command. From that moment forward, the plantation was no longer just a place of forced labor. It became a reflection of one man's moral collapse. A space where power erased empathy. In the next part, we will turn our attention to the person whose life was most affected by that collapse. The daughter. Her isolation. Her silence. Her psychological prison. And how neglect can be just as destructive as cruelty while the plantation thrived on the surface. Inside the mansion lived a woman slowly disappearing. The plantation owner's daughter did not suffer from chains or whips. But her prison was just as real. It was made of silence, shame, and neglect. From a young age, she learned that love was conditional. Praise came only when expectations were met. Affection depended on obedience. And approval was tied to appearance. She did not fit the image her world demanded. And because of that, she learned to shrink. In the 19th century, a woman's value was cruelly simple. She was expected to be beautiful, graceful, marriageable. Anything outside that narrow definition was treated as failure. For the plantation owner's daughter, every mirror became a reminder of disappointment. She heard the whispers. From servants. From guests. From relatives who smiled politely but spoke cruelly behind closed doors. Words like unfortunate, unmarriageable, a shame. Each one carved deeper wounds. Her isolation was not accidental. It was enforced. She was kept away from social gatherings. Hidden from visitors. Excluded from conversations that mattered. Not to protect her, but to protect the family's reputation. Over time, isolation became her normal. Days passed in quiet rooms. Long hours with no purpose. No future to imagine. When people are denied connection, they begin to believe they are undeserving of it. Psychologically, shame is powerful. It convinces a person that their suffering is deserved. That they are the problem. That silence is safer than hope. She stopped resisting emotionally. Because resistance had never saved her before. Her relationship with her father was distant and cold. There were no conversations about her fears. No concern for her loneliness. Only expectations she could never fulfill. To him, she was not a daughter in pain. She was an embarrassment. And when a parent withdraws emotional support, the damage is deep. Children internalize that rejection. They learn to blame themselves. By the time the decision was made, her sense of self was already fractured. She had been conditioned to obey. Conditioned to accept control. Conditioned to believe her body did not belong to her. This is what makes the tragedy so devastating. The choice that destroyed her life did not begin with violence. It began with neglect. With years of emotional abandonment that stripped her of resistance. Fear ruled her inner world. Fear of displeasing her father. Fear of judgment. Fear of being cast aside completely. And fear has a way of silencing even the strongest voice. When the order came, It did not arrive with explanation or compassion. There was no discussion. No consent. Just authority. Psychologically, this moment shattered what little agency she had left. Her identity collapsed. Her body became something managed by others. Her future decided without her voice. This is a form of trauma rarely spoken about. The trauma of having no choice. She did not scream. She did not fight. Not because she agreed. But because years of shame had taught her that resistance was useless. Inside, something broke quietly. And that silence would echo across the plantation. This part of the story is often misunderstood. People ask why she did not run. Why she did not refuse. But trauma does not always look like chaos. Sometimes, it looks like surrender. While the daughter lived in a prison of silence. Another life on the plantation was shaped by pain long before the decision was ever made. The enslaved man. His story did not begin on that land. It began with loss. He was born into a world where freedom was already stolen. Whether he arrived through inheritance, sale, or capture. His earliest memories were not of safety, but of fear. Fear of punishment. Fear of separation. Fear of never belonging to himself. From childhood, he learned one lesson above all others. Survival meant obedience. Questions invited pain. Resistance invited violence. Silence kept you alive. His body grew strong through forced labor. Fields hardened his hands. Punishment trained his reflexes. Exhaustion became routine. But strength did not mean power. It meant usefulness. On the plantation, he was watched constantly. Every step measured. Every word dangerous. He learned how to read moods. Not books. A glance from an overseer. A tone in the owner's voice. These signals decided whether a day ended in rest or suffering. Like many enslaved men, his identity was stripped away. His original name was erased. His history forgotten. His family scattered or destroyed. He became what the system demanded. A tool that worked. And did not speak. But inside, he was still human. He felt fear. He felt shame. He felt anger. Even if he never showed it. Suppressing emotion became a survival skill. The plantation owner viewed him as reliable. Strong. Quiet. Controlled. These traits made him visible. And visibility, in slavery, was dangerous. When he was summoned to the main house. He did not know why. Summons never came with explanation. They came with consequences. The order he received placed him in an impossible position. Refusal was unthinkable. Acceptance was devastating. Either path carried danger. This is the cruelty of slavery that is often misunderstood. Enslaved people were not participants by choice. They were trapped inside decisions made by others. Decisions backed by violence. Consent did not exist. He understood the risk immediately. Not only to himself, but to the woman whose life was already controlled. He was being forced into a role that would mark him forever. Psychologically, this creates a specific kind of trauma. A trauma where survival means carrying guilt for actions you never chose. A trauma where obedience feels like betrayal. But resistance feels like death. He did not have the luxury of morality. He had the burden of survival. Every step he took after that moment was watched more closely. Whispers followed him. Eyes judged him. He became a symbol of something unspeakable. Even though he had no power over it. At night, he carried fear in silence. Fear of punishment. Fear of retaliation. Fear that one wrong move would cost him his life. The system ensured he had no allies. Other enslaved people avoided attention. Overseers enforced separation. Isolation protected the plantation owner, not the enslaved. This is how slavery destroyed souls. Not just through whips and chains, but through forced complicity. By the time tragedy began unfolding across the plantation, he already knew the truth. Nothing good would come from this. And there would be no escape. Every tragedy has a moment where everything could have stopped. A pause. A second thought. A chance to choose humanity. This story had that moment. And it was ignored. The decision did not come in a burst of anger. It came quietly. Calculated. Deliberate. Made behind closed doors, where power felt safe from judgment. The plantation owner believed he was solving a problem. In his mind, this was not cruelty. It was control. Control over reputation. Control over silence. Control over lives. He did not consult his daughter. He did not explain. He did not ask. Because asking would mean acknowledging her humanity. And humanity was inconvenient. In the same way, the enslaved man was not given a choice. He was summoned. Instructed. Expected to comply. The command carried no emotion. Only authority. This is how moral lines disappear. Not with chaos. But with confidence. The decision rested on one dangerous belief. That power gives permission. Permission to decide for others. Permission to cross boundaries. Permission to redefine right and wrong. For the plantation owner, the system supported him. The law would not interfere. Society would not question. Silence would protect him. But what he failed to understand was that some actions carry consequences beyond law and reputation. Some lines, once crossed, change everything. When the order was enforced, the atmosphere on the plantation shifted. Not instantly, but unmistakably. People sensed it. Workers lowered their eyes. Voices grew quieter. Whispers spread without words. Fear changed shape. The daughter felt the weight of finality. What little control she believed she had was gone. Her future no longer belonged to her. For the enslaved man, the burden was immediate. He understood that survival now came at a terrible cost. He was trapped between obedience and irreversible damage. And neither path offered safety. This is the hidden violence of absolute power. It forces people into roles they never chose. And then judges them for surviving. The plantation owner did not look back. He told himself this was necessary. That order had been restored. That the problem had been handled. But moral collapse does not announce itself. It spreads. Quietly. From that day forward, the plantation carried a tension that never lifted. Routine continued. But something vital was broken. Trust. Dignity. Human connection. The land did not change. The buildings stood tall. But the people within them were altered. This decision did not end the story. It started the consequences. Consequences that would not arrive immediately. But would arrive inevitably, after the decision was made. Nothing looked different. And that was the most disturbing part. The fields still filled at sunrise. The bells still rang. Work continued as if order had been preserved. But beneath the routine, something fragile had shattered. The plantation entered a new phase. A quieter one. A heavier one. Silence was no longer peace. It was pressure. The daughter withdrew completely. She stopped appearing at meals. Stopped walking the gardens. Stopped meeting anyone's eyes. Her isolation became absolute. Inside the house, servants noticed the change. Rooms once lived in now felt abandoned. Curtains stayed drawn. Light avoided her spaces. This was not obedience. This was emotional collapse. She carried shame she did not choose. In that era, a woman's worth was tied to purity. But her purity had never been hers to protect. And society would never ask how it was taken. Her father avoided her. Not out of regret. But discomfort. She was a reminder. And powerful men do not like reminders of their own cruelty. Outside the house, the enslaved man lived under constant watch. His movements were restricted. His duties reassigned. Not for protection. But control. He had become dangerous in a new way. Not because he had done something wrong. But because he carried knowledge. Other enslaved people sensed it. They avoided him, not from hatred. But fear. Fear spreads quickly when survival is fragile. This is how slavery isolated its victims from each other. By turning shared suffering into private burdens. At night, whispers filled the quarters. No names were spoken. No details shared. Everyone understood the rule. Knowing too much could get you killed. The plantation owner believed he had stabilized the situation. From his perspective, the problem was contained. No public scandal. No resistance. No challenge to authority. But power often misunderstands silence. Silence is not agreement. It is endurance. The atmosphere grew tense. Overseers enforced discipline more harshly. Punishments increased, not for crimes, but for control. Fear became policy. The land absorbed the weight of it. Work slowed. Mistakes increased. Eyes lost focus. Trauma does that. Inside the daughter's room, time stopped. Days blurred together. Sleep disappeared. Thoughts looped endlessly. She questioned herself. As victims are taught to do. And yet, something unexpected began to form. Not strength. Not hope. But awareness. She began to see the system clearly. The lies it told. The roles it forced. The way it protected power at the cost of lives. For the enslaved man, survival became mechanical. Work. Eat. Sleep. Emotion was locked away. Because feeling was dangerous. But trauma does not stay buried. It waits. The plantation continued functioning. But it was decaying from within. Trust eroded. Fear deepened. Control tightened. This was no longer just one decision. It had become a chain reaction. And chains, once set in motion, pull everything down with them. Silence can be enforced. But it cannot be controlled forever. At first, the cracks were subtle. A delayed response in the fields. A missed command. An overseer repeating orders that were once obeyed instantly. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. But power senses hesitation the way animals sense danger. The plantation owner felt it. Not as guilt. Not as doubt. But as irritation. Something was slipping. And powerful men are trained to respond to loss of control with force. The overseers became harsher. Punishments came faster. Explanations were no longer required. Fear, once targeted, became indiscriminate. This was the system correcting itself. Or so it believed. But repression creates pressure. And pressure looks for exits. Among the enslaved people, communication changed. They spoke less openly. But listened more carefully. Eyes lingered. Signals replaced words. Shared glances became messages. Silence became language. The enslaved man noticed it first. Not hope. But movement. A shift in posture. A change in rhythm. Survival instincts awakening. He understood something dangerous. People were no longer only enduring. They were watching. Inside the house, the daughter sensed the same fracture. Servants hesitated around her now. Not out of disrespect. But awareness. They knew. Not the details. But the truth. Knowledge does not need clarity to be powerful. It only needs recognition. The plantation owner began withdrawing. He stayed longer in his study. Met fewer guests. Issued commands through intermediaries. This was not confidence. It was avoidance. Rumors spread beyond the plantation. Nothing explicit. Nothing provable. Just questions. Why had the daughter disappeared from society? Why had guards increased? Why had discipline intensified? In the 19th century South, reputation was currency. And whispers were inflation. The owner attempted to reassert order. A public gathering. A show of normalcy. A display of wealth and control. But performance cannot hide rot. Guests noticed the tension. Smiles that didn't reach eyes. Conversations that died too quickly. A house that felt watched rather than welcoming. Control was still present. But authority was weakening. Meanwhile, inside the enslaved quarters, resistance remained invisible. No rebellion. No uprising. Something more dangerous. Memory. Stories were being remembered. Patterns recognized. Connections made. The enslaved man became symbolic, not by choice. He represented what the system feared most. A witness. And witnesses do not need to speak loudly. They only need to survive. The daughter, isolated but observant, began writing. Not letters. Not confessions. Fragments. Thoughts hidden between pages. A private record of truth. Because when history refuses to listen, memory becomes rebellion. The plantation owner sensed the loss of narrative control. And narrative control is everything. He had ruled land, labor, and bodies. But stories? Stories were escaping him. And once a story escapes, it cannot be captured again. The silence was no longer stable. It was cracking. And through those cracks, consequences were beginning to breathe. Fear is most dangerous when it has nowhere to go. At first, the plantation owner believed fear was his weapon. A tool. A method. Something to be applied outward. But fear does not obey hierarchy. Once released, it spreads. And eventually, it turns inward. The overseers began to change. Men who once enforced discipline with certainty now acted with impatience. Overcorrection replaced judgment. Violence replaced control. This was not strength. This was anxiety. Every mistake felt like a threat. Every pause felt like defiance. Every silence felt intentional. The system was no longer responding to resistance. It was imagining it. Inside the main house, paranoia took root. Doors were locked earlier. Windows stayed shuttered. Night patrols doubled. The owner slept less. Dreams invaded his waking hours. Not nightmares of punishment, but exposure. He feared being seen. Not by the enslaved. Not by his peers. By history. Fear has a way of stripping away illusions. And the illusion of righteousness began to crack. The daughter sensed the shift immediately. Her father's authority felt brittle now. His voice sharper. His patience gone. He spoke to her less. But watched her more. Because she carried something dangerous. Not rebellion. Truth, she no longer cried. And that frightened him more than tears ever could. In the quarters, fear manifested differently. Not as panic, but precision. People measured words carefully. Movements became deliberate. Survival sharpened awareness. The enslaved man felt it in his body. A tension that never released. He understood something critical. Fear had entered the system itself. And systems that fear collapse from within. He did not need to act. The system was acting on itself. Small failures multiplied. Supplies went missing. Schedules broke down. Trust evaporated. The plantation owner blamed everyone but himself. Overseers. Servants. The enslaved. Blame is fear looking for shelter. Punishments increased. Not to correct behavior, but to reassure authority. But fear does not feel reassured by cruelty. It feels fed. The daughter began leaving her room at night. Quietly. Briefly. She stood in hallways, listening. Hearing the house breathe. This place, once a symbol of power, now felt like a cage. She realized something irreversible. Her father was trapped too. Trapped by reputation. By expectation. By his own decisions. Fear had consumed him. And fear was now consuming the plantation. Nothing dramatic had happened yet. No fire. No revolt. No scandal. But collapse rarely announces itself. It whispers. The enslaved man watched the land closely. He noticed the owner avoided the fields now. That overseers argued among themselves. That commands contradicted each other. Fear had fragmented authority. And fragmentation is the beginning of the end. Truth does not need permission to exist. It only needs time. For months, the plantation had survived on denial. Routines. Rules. Appearances. But truth is patient. And pressure makes it persistent. The breaking point did not arrive loudly. It arrived quietly. Through a mistake. A servant spoke to the wrong person. A name was mentioned when it shouldn't have been. A pause lingered too long in conversation. And suddenly, what had been rumor gained shape. Questions spread. Not accusations. Questions. And questions are more dangerous than blame. Why was the daughter still hidden away? Why was the enslaved man reassigned repeatedly? Why had the plantation changed so drastically? The owner felt it immediately. That cold sensation of losing narrative control. He attempted suppression. Dismissals. Threats. Warnings. But suppression only confirmed suspicion. The daughter knew the moment had arrived. Not because she wanted it, but because she felt relief. She stopped hiding her writings. Not openly, but carelessly. A page left where it could be found. A fragment too honest to ignore. Once words exist outside the mind, they cannot be taken back. The enslaved man was questioned. Not officially. Quietly. He said nothing. And that silence said everything. Because truth does not always speak. Sometimes it stands still. And waits to be recognized. The plantation owner panicked. For the first time, his power felt insufficient. He summoned allies. Men like him. Men who understood reputation more than morality. But even they hesitated. Because scandal spreads faster than loyalty. The daughter confronted her father. Not with rage. With clarity. She spoke calmly. And calm is terrifying to those built on control. She named what he had done. Not dramatically. Precisely. There was no denial. Only silence. Because denial requires confidence. And confidence was gone. The plantation was no longer stable. Authority fractured. Trust evaporated. Truth was no longer buried. It was walking freely. Not as spectacle. As consequence. The enslaved man realized something profound. Survival had turned into testimony. The system had created its own evidence. This was not justice. Not yet. But it was exposure. And exposure changes everything. When truth becomes visible, power loses its shelter. The fallout did not come as a storm. It came as distance. Invitations stopped arriving. Visits were delayed. Letters went unanswered. In the 19th century South, this was not coincidence. It was judgment. Reputation was everything. And reputation, once damaged, did not heal quietly. Neighbors spoke carefully now. Not out of respect, but caution. The plantation owner felt the shift immediately. Meetings shortened. Conversations avoided eye contact. He was no longer admired. He was evaluated. Society did not condemn him openly. That would require courage. Instead, it did something far more effective. It withdrew protection. Business agreements stalled. Political favors disappeared. Support thinned. Power relies on networks. And his network was dissolving. Inside the plantation, authority collapsed further. Overseers questioned orders. Servants hesitated before responding. Fear had changed sides. The daughter was no longer invisible. People noticed her presence again. Not with warmth, but recognition. They saw her differently now. Not as a failure, but as evidence. She did not seek sympathy. She sought distance. Because survival now meant separation from the man who had decided her fate. The enslaved man experienced the fallout differently. Not as visibility, but vulnerability. Exposure did not equal protection. It only shifted danger. Yet something fundamental had changed. He was no longer just property. He was known. And being known, even in silence, altered how others treated him. The plantation owner attempted recovery. Public gestures. Donations. Displays of respectability. But gestures cannot erase memory. Shame followed him quietly. It did not shout. It waited. And shame is patient. Inside himself, reckoning began. Not moral reckoning, but existential. He questioned not what he had done, but whether it had been worth it. This is how unjust systems fail. Not through regret. Through realization of cost. The plantation stood physically intact. Fields still planted. Buildings still standing. But its authority was broken. The illusion of control. Gone. This was not justice. No trial. No public confession. But it was consequence. And consequence is history's favorite weapon. In the next part, we will explore what remains after collapse. What survival looks like when power fades. And how memory outlives empires when power collapses. It does not disappear. It leaves residue. The plantation did not vanish overnight. The land remained. The buildings stood. The fields continued to demand labor. But something essential was gone. Belief. No one fully believed in the authority anymore. They complied. But without conviction. This is what remains after domination fails. Structure without soul. The plantation owner lived on. But smaller. Not in wealth. In presence. He was still there. But he was no longer central. People no longer revolved around him. They moved past him. That is the true cost of power abused. Irrelevance. The daughter left the plantation. Not dramatically. Not publicly. Quietly. She carried no inheritance of land. Only memory. And memory is heavier than property. She would live a life shaped by silence. But no longer defined by it. Survival, for her, meant distance. Distance from the house. From the decisions. From the man who mistook ownership for authority. The enslaved man survived as well. That alone was resistance. History rarely records survival. It prefers victories and defeats. But survival is where truth lives. He carried forward what could not be erased. Witness. He would not be named in ledgers, not honored in monuments. But he existed beyond the system that tried to consume him. And that matters. The plantation eventually changed hands. As all power does. New owners. New rules. Same land. But the story lingered. Whispers passed between generations. A cautionary tale. A discomfort people avoided naming. Because memory does not need accuracy to endure. It needs meaning. And the meaning was clear. Power without restraint destroys itself. The system of slavery would eventually fall. Not because of stories like this alone. But because of millions of lives broken under its weight. This story is not exceptional. That is what makes it unbearable. It represents countless moments where control was mistaken for right. Where silence was mistaken for consent. Where humans were reduced to roles. What remains is not justice. History rarely offers that. What remains is responsibility. To remember. To acknowledge. To refuse repetition. Because when stories are buried, they rot. When they are remembered, they warn. And this story, like so many others, warns us, power always demands a price, and eventually, it collects.